There is a moment in history so charged with tension, so loaded with pride, rivalry, and desperate calculation, that it changed the very way wars would be fought and won forever. And almost nobody talks about what Winston Churchill truly felt the day Dwight D. Eisenhower was handed supreme command over the greatest military operation the world had ever seen. If this story of hidden power struggles, wounded national pride, and hard-won wisdom between two of history's most consequential leaders moves you, consider subscribing to this channel right now, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who loves real history, not the sanitized version, but the raw, complicated truth. And drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know before watching. Your engagement keeps stories like this alive. It was December 1943. And the war in Europe had reached a decisive crossroads. The Allied forces had pushed through North Africa, fought their way up the brutal terrain of Sicily and into Italy, and the Soviet Union was grinding Germany down from the east in battles of incomprehensible scale and violence. But everyone, from the generals to the foot soldiers to the desperate populations living under occupation, knew that the war's true turning point would come only when the Western Allies crossed the English Channel and landed on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The question was not whether this invasion would happen. The question was who would lead it. And that question carried within it all the weight of empire, ego, strategy, and survival that two very different men, one a veteran British statesman shaped by Victorian imperialism, the other a Kansas-born American general shaped by modern industrial warfare, had spent their entire careers preparing for without knowing it. Winston Churchill had been fighting this war longer than almost anyone in the alliance. He had been warning about Adolf Hitler since the early 1930s, when most British politicians preferred comfortable blindness to uncomfortable truth. He had stood before the House of Commons in May 1940, after the catastrophic fall of France, and promised his nation nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and somehow, impossibly, his voice had held the line. He had survived the Blitz, the fall of Singapore, the disaster at Tobruk, the near collapse of the entire British war effort in the Middle East. By 1943, Churchill was 69 years old, suffering from recurring pneumonia, his body carrying the weight of 3 years of relentless crisis management, and yet his mind burned with the fierce, territorial instinct of a man who believed, truly believed, that Britain's role in shaping the post-war world depended on who held the sword when the final blow was struck. And that sword, in Churchill's vision, was supposed to be held by a British hand. The man Churchill had in mind was General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, arguably the most professionally accomplished British military officer of the entire war. Brooke was cold, precise, intellectually formidable, and deeply skeptical of American strategic thinking, which he found impulsive and dangerously oversimplified. He had served in the First World War, commanded the British Expeditionary Force during the nightmarish retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, and had spent 3 grinding years at Churchill's side in the highest councils of Allied strategy. Brooke wanted command of Operation Overlord with a fierce, controlled hunger, and Churchill had all but promised it to him. A promise made not in writing, not in public, but in the intimate, smoke-filled rooms where great decisions were actually born, over brandy and maps and the murmured calculus of empire. Brooke believed it. Churchill believed it. And then America arrived with checkbooks and an army and changed everything. By the Tehran Conference in late November and early December of 1943, the arithmetic of Allied power had shifted in ways that could no longer be politely ignored. The United States had mobilized an industrial and military machine of staggering proportions. American factories were producing more war material in a single month than Britain could manage in several. American troop numbers in Britain were growing at a rate that would soon dwarf anything the British Isles could field. And Joseph Stalin, at Tehran, that extraordinary gathering where the big 3 met face to face for the first time, made his position unmistakably clear. Stalin wanted Overlord launched by May 1944, and he wanted to know who was in command. When no name came from the Western Allies, Stalin's suspicion hardened into something approaching contempt. He had watched too many conferences produce too many beautiful promises and too little action. He needed a name, and that name would determine everything. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood what Stalin was really asking. And he understood something else that cut even deeper. The commander of Overlord would be the man whose country bore the greatest burden of that operation's execution. By late 1943, it was becoming undeniable that the United States would provide the majority of the troops, the landing craft, the air cover, and the logistical support for the cross-channel assault. Roosevelt had originally considered George C. Marshall, his Army Chief of Staff, the man many considered the single most indispensable American officer of the entire war, a figure of such calm authority and organizational genius that Roosevelt himself reportedly said he could not sleep at night thinking about sending Marshall overseas and losing him from Washington. It was one of the most agonizing personnel decisions Roosevelt ever faced. Marshall wanted the command. His colleagues believed he had earned it. And yet, after long private deliberation, Roosevelt concluded he could not let Marshall go. The man who would lead Overlord would instead be Dwight David Eisenhower. We are now at the midpoint of this story. A story about what happens when national pride collides with historical necessity, when the command of armies becomes inseparable from the shape of the world that follows. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it right now. It takes 3 seconds, and it means you will never miss a story like this one. Like this video if history told without compromise matters to you. Share it with a friend who thinks they know World War II. And leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most so far, because the most interesting part is still ahead. Eisenhower received the news of his appointment on December 7, 1943, the second anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a date that carried its own freight of American memory and sacrifice. He was in North Africa when Roosevelt told him simply, "You will command Overlord." Eisenhower's reaction was characteristically restrained in public and quietly thunderous in private. He understood the magnitude immediately, not just as a military challenge, but as a political one of the highest order. He would be commanding not just Americans, but Britons, Canadians, Poles, Free French, and soldiers from a dozen occupied nations, all of them carrying their own histories, their own chains of command, their own political masters. He would be answering to two heads of government with radically different visions of what victory should look like and who should benefit from it. And he would be doing all of this while managing the volcanic personalities of men like Bernard Montgomery, George Patton, Arthur Tedder, and Trafford Lee Mallory, each a genius in his own right and each a potential catastrophe if mishandled. Churchill's response to the appointment of Eisenhower was one of the most revealing moments of his entire wartime leadership, not because of what he said publicly, but because of what he was forced to reckon with privately. He had to tell Alan Brooke that the command was gone, and that conversation, recorded in Brooke's diary with barely contained bitterness, was devastating. Brooke wrote that it was the greatest disappointment of his life, and that Churchill's communication of the news was, at best, awkward, a word that carried enormous weight coming from a man as controlled as Brooke. Churchill himself felt genuine guilt. He had made a promise, and circumstances had unmade it for him. But Churchill was also a political realist of the highest order, and he understood with crystalline clarity what the American appointment meant. The center of gravity in the Western Alliance had shifted, permanently and irrevocably, from London to Washington. What Churchill realized in those weeks of December 1943 and the months that followed was not simply that Eisenhower was in charge. What he realized, and what took enormous intellectual honesty to accept, was that Britain's ability to shape the outcome of the war and the peace that followed was now dependent on its capacity to influence American decisions rather than make its own. The era of British strategic independence, the era in which a British general would lead the decisive campaign of the defining conflict of the century, had quietly ended. Churchill had spent his entire adult life in the shadow of British imperial power, had risen through it, had served it, had fought for it through the darkest hours. And now, in the winter of 1943, sitting in Tehran, and then Cairo, and then back in London as the pneumonia took hold and his body finally demanded rest, he understood that the world after this war would be an American world, and that Britain's best strategy was to make itself indispensable to that world rather than rival it. This realization did not make Churchill passive. It made him, in some ways, more politically brilliant than ever. He pursued what he would later call the special relationship with a strategic intensity that bordered on obsession, understanding that Britain's influence in the post-war order would flow not from independent military strength, which the war had exhausted, but from proximity to American power and the ability to shape American thinking. His relationship with Eisenhower became one of the most carefully managed partnerships of the entire war. Churchill visited Eisenhower's headquarters repeatedly in the months before D-Day, arguing, cajoling, challenging, sometimes infuriating the American general with schemes that ranged from brilliant to reckless. Eisenhower, for his part, developed a genuine respect for Churchill that never quite erased the frustration of managing him, and a genuine affection that never quite resolved the tension of disagreeing with him on fundamental questions of strategy. The preparation for Operation Overlord through the spring of 1944 was a masterwork of organizational complexity that has never been fully replicated in the history of warfare. Eisenhower established his supreme headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHAF, and brought together a team of officers whose collective experience spanned every theater of the war. Montgomery, who had beaten Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942 and commanded the Allied ground forces through Sicily and into Italy, was given command of the ground assault phase. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, was crafted to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, and it worked with a precision that still astonishes historians. Meanwhile, along the southern coast of England, from Cornwall to Kent, the greatest armada in human history was quietly assembling. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of men, all waiting for the weather and the tide and the word from the Kansas general, who now held the fate of Western civilization in his hands. On June 4, 1944, Eisenhower faced what many historians consider the loneliest decision ever made by a military commander. The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th, but the weather over the channel was catastrophic. High winds, heavy seas, low cloud cover that would blind the airborne operations and expose the landing craft to destruction. His meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, delivered a forecast that offered a narrow window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. Every commander in the room had reservations. The cost of going was enormous. The cost of waiting, of losing surprise and momentum, and the alignment of tide and moon that had taken months to calculate, was potentially greater. Eisenhower sat quietly for a long moment and then said, in words that have echoed through history, "Okay, we'll go." Churchill, when he learned the decision had been made, is reported to have said to his wife Clementine that when he thought of the young men going into those beaches the next morning, he could barely bear it. The landings on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, were the largest amphibious operation in history and one of the most costly single days of the entire war. At Omaha Beach, American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced obstacles and German fire that turned the shoreline into a vision of pure horror, with casualties so severe that Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, briefly considered abandoning the beachhead entirely. They did not abandon it. They pushed forward with a courage that transcended orders, transcended training, transcended everything except the absolute refusal to fail the men dying beside them. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had secured a foothold in France, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. Churchill, standing in the House of Commons the following day, announced the landings with a voice that carried every year of the war in its weight and tremor. And somewhere in the complicated architecture of his feelings, pride, relief, grief, and a long, clear-eyed recognition of what had passed, was the understanding that Eisenhower had been exactly the right man for the moment, and that the moment was larger than any single nation's claim upon it. This is the story that most history books compress into dates and maps and arrows on a page. But the truth is that it was made of human choices, national anxieties, wounded pride, and the extraordinary capacity of certain individuals to rise above themselves when everything was at stake. Churchill's journey from the man who wanted a British general at the head of the greatest invasion in history to the man who stood in the House of Commons and reported its success is a story about the hardest kind of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from letting go. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone in your life who deserves to hear it. And leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most, or what piece of this history you are going to look up tonight. Because every comment reminds us that real history, told with honesty and depth, still has the power to change the way we see the world.